How can I tell you that's true? When a kid comes in and drowns, like say where you live in cold water, we code them all the way for 45 minutes because we know the other free radical chemicals can act as terminal electron acceptors, like hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide. We can still save those kids, so we don't give up on them. But the thing is, that's from our evolutionary past. We lose that ability as soon as they cut the umbilical cord and the kid takes its first breath of air.
Because then the hypoxia is gone, this metabolic switch happens, and yeah, I mean, it just switches everything.
You got it.
And
And the problem is
this
when
is why you use the
you change
word
your environment,
yeah.
you change your environment to what we've done now, you begin to realize that the electromagnetic signals outside are doing things to that oxygenation state on the inside. And what do we know from Nora Volkow's work? We know that non-native EMF and blue light, what's the fundamental thing they do? They cause a drop in NAD positive and pseudohypoxia. That's all you need to
Yeah.
know, because what
And
happens then? Blood glucose spikes. So does insulin. And guess what? Then all the food gurus are like, oh, it's all about food. No, it's not. It's all about light. And it's always been about light. But you know what the problem is? All the food gurus learned from who? The biochemists.
mm-hmm.
That's actually, if you want to know the most interesting part of this story for me that recently happened, a guy named Cameron Borg, who runs his own podcast, interviewed Andrew Marino, who, Marino was Becker's right hand man. And the thing that I was really disappointed with in that podcast is Marino clearly didn't do any of Becker's work. All the stuff that I just told you, I basically finished his thesis. But here's the really sad thing. He, in that podcast, said that he had a discussion with Michael Levin when he was a young scientist. And he warned him, your mentor is one of the guys that try to put Becker to sleep and get him out of science, because Becker was telling people that it was more about the biophysics than the biochemistry. And your mentor is one of those biochemists. So the reason I tell you this story, because I know you're a PhD and you've listened to now the whole story, you understand my perspective. You understand now why, when I talk to PhDs in biochemistry, and I know they don't have this perspective because they were never given. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that they went through what we just all went through in COVID, where they were told a half part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't hear the whole truth. And when you don't know the whole truth, then it gets to, the stuff that where you and I got entangled. We got entangled through Kevin. Why? I got entangled with Kevin's life because Kevin didn't know the whole truth about something he should have known about that I knew about. And I decided to drag him into this story without him really knowing about it. And the reason these things weren't discoverable is because they were whitewashed from science. And what am I telling you? The reason you don't know this is not because you're a bad guy, Nick, or Michael Levin's a bad guy, or, Jaffe. Jaffe was a bad guy, and so was Phil Handler, because they knew the truth and they buried it. The real problem is, if you don't learn the stuff, I can't expect you to know it. But I'm that one guy that's been intensely curious about Becker's work from when I learned about it. And I told you a couple of key things that happened. I did a podcast with Danny Jones 6 months ago where I told the story about how I saved a girl's life after her head gets bashed in. And what did I use? I used methylene blue to do it. Turns out I never do that if I don't know this story from Becker's work. Why?
Mm-hmm.
6-7 years earlier in 1992, my mentor in neurosurgery made me go learn about Becker's work. And guess what? That's where I learned about the paramagnetic switch. And I realized
Mm-hmm.
that I could actually help save her life if I did two things. I gave her methylene blue, and I used hypertonic saline in her cardiovascular system so that I could direct the current to organs that were failing while she was having bone picked out of her brain. And it worked. And it turned out the lesson of the great oxygenation event happened right there in my surgical suite in front of my eyes. And I was stunned that it actually worked. And then I started to wonder, is this operational in many more diseases that are out there? And what did I do over the last 20 years? Right before Becker died, I went down and sat down with him. Probably later this month, my whole decentralized thesis that I've told you today will be laid out with the mathematics to prove that I'm axiomatically correct about this. And I shared it with Becker before he died. Why? He was the greatest scientist of my generation. And he was stifled because the government didn't want this information out. Why? Because they were moving from an industrial economy to an information tech
Mhm.
economy, which was going to make everybody hypoxic with and dehydrated so that you would be warbird shifted and you would no longer be the TCA mammal you're supposed to be. And that would lead to all the chronic diseases that Bobby Kennedy is trying to fix by banning red dye number 6 and Fruit Loops, which is a total good story. And you have to realize you laughed, so I know you're following the story along pretty well now. You understand why I'm pretty pissed off about it. Because every time somebody's tried to tell the truth, you get cockblocked by the people that are controlling the narrative. And I believe through the process that I told you, that you will be able to go back as a scientist and fact check Uncle Jack, seeing the pieces that you were never taught, then putting them together with the biochemical pathways and the evolutionary biology that I know you know, and you're going to go, this explains a lot of things
Yeah. I,
that I had questions about.
yeah. Well, so I just want to say this because it just came to mind to me spontaneously. So everything that we just talked about for the last few minutes, the switch that happens depending on oxygen levels due to the magnetism. There's this famous quote when you're in evolution development and you learn about the history. There's this famous saga that involves a man named Ernst Haeckel, and he said ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and we don't need to get into the historical details there, but there was this notion that people argued about that the development of an individual somehow resembled the evolution of species generally. And what you told me, Jack, to the extent all that's true, what you actually did kind of reminded me of that, because what you're saying is actually the explosion in growth and complexity that happens when the baby goes from being hypoxic to oxygenated actually is due fundamentally to the same thing. It's the same pattern and the same forces driving it as the explosion that you see in, say, the Cambrian explosion or the adaptive radiation of mammals. You go from that low oxygen to high oxygen environment that unlocks the energetic potential to drive that complexity.
Nick, you make me happy because now you begin to understand when you open up Langman's embryology book why we used to look like tadpoles. It's
Mm-hmm.
there. The whole story is there. When you actually see this story in totality and you sit down with a glass of wine, you go, Jesus Christ, we have so much wrong. And it's just because we're missing the key parts of this story. And when you see the parts put together, I mean, you'll see the next year on my blog, I'm going to take diseases that you know have no answer, like keratoconus. This is one of my favorite ones because you go to an ophthalmologist and they're like, yeah, why does your cornea form what it does? Well, they have Fleischer rings. You know what those Fleischer rings are made out of? Hemosiderin. You know that hemosiderin is paramagnetic? Think that might have a role to play in this story? Damn right it does. That's why you create a volcano in the middle of their cornea. And guess what? You go to an ophthalmologist today, they have no earthly idea. Well, guess what? I know what causes it. I know exactly what causes it because it changes the electrical resistance of the anterior part of the eye. And guess what? What's the end report, the end result of broken down hemoglobin? You know that answer. Turns out that's what the Fleischer Ming is made out of. And that goes right to Becker's story. When you begin to understand this paramagnetic switch story and how it ties into metabolic fluxes and switches, you start to go, what's built in us is absolutely spectacular.